in how you go about discussing, working with, consuming, and interpreting data. Before we get started, we're going to do some introductions. So, my name's Devin. I'm a PhD candidate at Mass University in Ontario. If you're curious how a kid from the Bronx ended up in Canada in psychology, and before I returned to academia to do my PhD, I've worked in education and market research.
I'm Mona, currently a science editor in software. My master's background is also in psych. Worked in enterprise education. Floated over into, I guess, like a whole lot of tech world. So excited to be here to talk to you today about the responsible use of demographic.
First, we're going to go into the statistical demographic information, how it's achieved in analytics. We're going to move into the meat of the first part of our talk, which is kind of the question of that status quo. What are we doing when we focus on analyzing demographic data the way we tend to now? And then finally, we're going to walk through a little bit of a guided demonstration where we're going to incorporate more interesting data to tell who are more interesting stories when we talk about demographic information in general. Preparing for this talk, what motivated this idea was a common problem with women I saw in our careers, especially when we worked in education, which was some metric of interest, whether that was like math, reading, program engagement. Well, the request is to be broken out by demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. That's a whole other problem. But we're going to argue that some of this sounds good in theory, as some sports or work. But essentially, what we're going to argue about when we look at data like this, it tends to focus fundamentally on individuals as opposed to larger systems. Focus on individual problems. Nonprofit, where we have some metric of interest, and we want to look at this like a graphic equation. And usually, this is kind of be like some end you might see people interested.
Feel free to shout out any. What does this chart mean? What does it say? Feel free to shout that. Great.
Or I can see, or okay, and it's not. No one. They all seem to the different colors. It's 4 different colors for one group. Each color for 1-to-1 graphs. Some are above each other, so it means there's a range of something going on here.
So, yeah, there's really a difference. And for anyone who can't see it, the x-axis over here is time. So this starts in 2006 and 2012. The y-axis is an average of math scores taken from NYC Open Data. And then the groups are demographic categories that were provided as part of the data. So census or most forms usually ask race separately from ethnicity. So I wonder whether there's overlaps between Hispanic, Asian, Black, white. Oh, there might be overlaps between Hispanic versus Asian, Black, white.
That certain, you said that here is the horizontal. See that each group would had spikes and drops.
2019, something happened, like all the scores going up before 2019, and then starting at 2009, kind of plateaued a little bit.
I don't know where the demographics are pulled from. I don't know why those particular years. I don't know what the baseline for the average math source. So being able to know those sources, why those sources are compiled the way they were, why those relational points were analyzed. Those are all the questions I have when I see that chart, and it's like an opportunity to kind of fill in a lot of those questions. Very common particular end product, how data might be presented to the stakeholders.
Counterintuitive. I was thinking if there are disparities, and that's usually what we tend to be interested in when we're looking at that graphic information. We want to know where that is. But I would argue when we focus on data just like this, primarily focus on individuals categorized like in these brackets, we tend to focusing on the wrong thing. Like I kind of said earlier, we focus on individuals and not the things that are happening to them at our level. repetitive nature of kind of graphs like that, plot like that, questions like that, or with I mentioned earlier for a graph that there might be an interest in something like statistically significant differences between groups. This is kind of in the realm of like inferential statistics. The graph we thought something a little more descriptive, like a scene over time. But in order for us to ground and understand what's happening when we ask questions like this, I have to go back in time. For psychologists for training, there's a history, sort of history, of looking at demographic groups. For those of you who may know, for example, IQ research, some of my colleagues will argue still has its merits, was fundamentally rooted in trying to prove deficits between races. Some groups superior, some groups were inferior. But what I didn't know until I got to grad school for my PhD and dove into the history is that a lot of the actual statistical models that we use to create these statistically significant differences were designed for a very different purpose to find differences in individuals. So, for example, Fisher and Fisher F-tests, on which we designed for a sole purpose, or intended purpose, to support some of its terrible IQ stuff, and go, yep, where we see significant differences, we can make about individuals being deficit compared to ours. Peer groups, modeling methods that are used, whatever what's not really interesting at all, I go for history, or something like regression modeling and regression analysis. One of the first documented uses of regression analysis in social research, particularly on poverty, was conservative thinking to argue against support for kind of resource support outside of courthouses. And this was inspired by this kind of dark Malthusian theory that if you provide more people with more resources, they'll populate and they'll acquire more resources on more people. So, what is that saying? If I want to say, I want to argue that the math of all this and why equal x plus p is problematic and right. But when we talk about demographic information and analyzing data like this to meet the purpose, we have to be aware, that some of those methods are popular, we're not aware of that. One thing, kind of building off of that idea, is when we want to analyze data and we use demographics, for example, race, ethnicity, gender, there's interesting critical data literature that points to some of the issues of incorporating that variable in statistical models. And an interesting argument in critical data literature argues that incorporating a variable such as demographics, race, ethnicity, gender, isn't methodologically safe to be put into some of these models. For instance, because there's an argument for causation, it's random absorptive, we actually turn a demographic variable into a variable for a causal model. We're able to avoid the one sort of analyses and sound modeling perspective, we may not be wanting to put these in our model and may not be making the correct inferences just by the sake of what conceptually, what variable is going for.
I think if you're going to take a single thing away from the very broad and very, I think, negative and problematic history of research, of social research, it's if your be-all end-all looks something like that graph and you're not providing any kind of context, which we will go through an example of how you can potentially do so, you are potentially just reinforcing eugenicist notions, the idea that certain groups that were measured on the graph performed worse. And if you're not providing any context around those individuals as to why, you are potentially just reinforcing negative beliefs about those existing groups and not necessarily doing anything to improve the gap. So I want to spend a minute talking about these two forms here. You might be familiar with the first one. The first one is the sample race category from the US Census. This is, I believe, from the 2010 census, so it might have looked a little bit different in 2020. But you'll notice that there are categories that may or may not actually represent you as a person. Maybe you felt uncomfortable filling that out yourself or filling out demographic information in some other context. And then you'll notice the form on the bottom, which is actually the Canadian census. So if you go between two geographic contexts that are, I think, by all means, relatively similar, contexts in which you might want to measure similar metrics, you're not actually going to be able to do so because these categories are very different. And ultimately what you're seeing here, and if you look at the history of these, and I'll recommend we have a couple of resources that we recommend at the end. Ultimately, what these forms are designed to do is measure, are you a member of the dominant or majority group, or a member of one of many different minority groups broken down to a level that from a statistical perspective, you can't really do much in many cases. Where if you are a minority, there are fewer people being represented in the group, your statistical analysis is going to have less of a representative sample. Yeah, and I think on the next slide, what I'll actually talk more about is even within the same context. For example, if you are in the United States, you assume that there are similar race and ethnicity and EEOC categories, but even within that, the way in which these are measured are often markedly different. I believe you actually pointed out that Hispanic or not Hispanic is often a separate question. That is how it's represented on the EEOC, but a lot of forms actually include it as a separate race. Whereas some people will have an option where that's the only thing you can pick. Other people on other surveys have the ability to pick multiple categories in which they're represented differently. So these are examples from, honestly, I just looked them up online on survey tools. So like SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, these are default forms that are made available to you for your data collection. And ultimately, you'll see that there are just serious problems with each of them. This one says choose only one. And then assumes that if you're multiple ethnicities, you're just a separate category as opposed to belonging to multiple groups that may or may not even be properly represented by these above categories. This example represents gender as a binary variable, which if you don't reasonably fit into one of those categories, you might either skip it or just pick one of the two to move on with the survey. And then the next one takes age, which is a number, which is actually a way better indicator in a statistical model, and buckets it up. Like, these are common, but ultimately they're arbitrary. And then finally, a measure of sexual orientation, which brings in different questions of, is that sensitive information that if you capture could potentially put somebody in danger?
Just say and.
Oh, yes.
Oh, I was just going to add that I think specifically, at least in the US, like the ways in which like a marginalized group could become categorized as the dominant group, like Arabs don't have a separate category that they can use. Not that the other categories are great anyways, but like specifically for them, and they end up having to use white. And I noticed in the Canadian census, there is a separate category.
Oh, that's an excellent, like, I think for anyone who didn't hear, Arab and Middle Eastern is technically classified as white, which I think, for example, I'm actually from the Middle East. Like, I could potentially put white, but if you met my dad, he's not, but that's what the US classifies him as. But
also, when we teach, I'm a math teacher, when we teach statistics, we don't bring in the bias, right? The bias could be good or bad, okay? We don't bring in the history. We just teach the course. And that's why when I teach statistics, I feel a certain way I teach it, because I know I have to bring in the history. I cannot just bring data without bringing in the history. And I think that's what public education in New York City and elsewhere, we need to be able to address that, because if not, we miseducating the whole generation. And so what's the point? Adult education is supposed to enlighten you to make you a better individual, not the opposite.
yeah, 100%. Especially with the history of the specific methods that we
Yes.
covered in statistics, it is incredibly problematic, and we use them today as if they're still just formulas you should memorize along with the ways in which you do long division. It doesn't make sense.
I'm sorry, it really bothers me when I teach that course. I'm not gonna lie to you. I get my head because I have to get this wrapped around, because of who I am. I have to be honest with you, because there is a history, New York City and elsewhere. I mean, we have to respect that. As an educator, I just don't see why we shouldn't. It's a problem for me. I have a major problem with education.
I think from the, I'd love to add just one thing. I think what you said about like Arabs belonging to white, like the white category. I know like within the community, like we've often talked about, or like at least like conversation that I've heard is, do you want to be represented as a separate category? But if the federal government is, you know, incredibly racist and has problems with you, do you want to be identified? And it's probably not. Which points out, I think, you know, that my conclusion with these types of forms is they're political tools. They're not representations of you and your experience. And what matters to aggregate people and understand trends about them, what's important to them, or how to actually create access and equity for them.
Well, I love fancy ways to solve problems. So this is like all what this slide is about. And focusing on what we've been talking about so far, when we have this laser focus on the demographic information, and that becomes the primary strategy where we're looking across all of our metrics. There becomes a fundamental issue when we start to focus, as I mentioned before, on individuals. And what that does is it starts to turn the people themselves into things to be solved, as opposed to the things being done to them. I think that we should focus on. Theoretical psychologist Thomas Teo called this the problem-making issue. This is in psychology, but also in analytics that has this kind of emphasis. When we are only focused on the repetitive nature of just slicing data by demographic information, and maybe having a quick look and a little, it leads to an issue where the people become things to fix. All of the problems, all of the solutions we can think of become individualized, hyper-individualized. How can we get to be more resilient, as an example? Probably heard this.
Okay, we did include a good amount of code at the end, but I want it for everybody here with your different perspectives. I want to at least include just some steps that you can take to get away from just breaking down whatever data you're looking at by demographic information and calling it a day. We understand that in a lot of cases, you are being asked to do so by your stakeholders, by superiors, by executives, you name it. That's just part of the status quo in a lot of areas in terms of how to represent this information. Really, what we wanted to do is just show you two steps, and we're going to walk through this on the notebook that we have later on, is it's often very easy and very possible in the NYC open data sets to augment those data sets and the raw data with more useful level that's at a level higher than the individual. So for example, the first step that we did, and we'll walk through this, is we took the math test results by race and ethnicity, and we augmented that data with the metadata from the middle school directory, pulling in all the information and characteristics about those schools in that year. And what we found were a number of potentially very interesting school level properties that were actually more predictive of outcomes than just what race you were a part of. So the math teacher to student ratio was a very important indicator. That was very easy to derive from that metadata, and that's potentially much more actionable. There was also a safety coefficient. There were the number of potential routes to the school as an indicator of the accessibility and commutability of that school. There was an indicator as to whether or not the school had after-school programs. So any one of these is potentially something that you can recommend as a solid action in a policy setting, as opposed to just tracking differences between groups over time and hoping that those lines converge at some point and that the gap goes away. The next step that you can do, which I would argue is actually like it's technically a higher level of abstraction, but you're bringing in a whole new set of data that might actually be like even more helpful as far as neighborhood level properties. I strongly recommend you look at the US Census API if you ever need to look at data from a geographical level. You can pull thousands, I believe, of indicators on the level of the zip code, such as household composition, neighborhood population density, neighborhood area median income, you name it. I think the reason we didn't actually include that as an example is because there were thousands and thousands of indicators there that you can use. But we will walk you through the documentation so you can get a sense as to what that looks like. Okay, so if you still need to use demographic information, we recommend designing a plan of care. And the request that we included here is an example. This is one I can think of. I get voices in my head telling me this from my previous jobs. I would like to see engagement in the after-school program broken out by race, gender, and sexual orientation. So what do you do?
Kind of the idea of designing a plan of care, and this even went all the way back even to the idea of the soon as you start to have the question of placing demographic data by a particular metric by demographic data, more often than not, people have some implicit idea of what they're looking for. Make that explicit in relation to this common ask where you're asked to, we'd like to see. There are ways you can go about giving a little bit of pushback to make the ask. You already have a strong kind of like a priori hypothesis about what the results will show. What are you expecting to find so we can start to think about what we can already do to make improvements if you already have questions. But actually the recommendation is taken based upon your findings. If you find what your hypothesis or what you're thinking is true, that's how do we go about implementing this kind of plan of care. Have a serious conversation around what interpretations you're getting from the differences, the changes. But what I will say, and this is more some kind of personal professional experience, pushing back on acts like these can be dicey. As working in education, I was once asked, hey, we have a funder that would like to take a look at all of the students that have a question on sexual orientation. Which that might like, why do you want to see that data? What do you want to do with it? Hey, there's accountability issues here, but when you're dealing with funders, sometimes you just have to give it the very least. Well, so you want to have this idea of a plan of care, asking questions like these, and even if you are unable to make an immediate change in how people ask questions, just asking these questions gets a conversation going in the environment you work in, which down the line, hopefully. In short, before we move on then to the guided data demo, where disparities exist, but the story doesn't end there. And what we would hope that individual would take away on a practical standpoint is that when people or when you're asking questions that involve demographic data, make your assumptions plan of care. You expect to find what are some recommendations, and of course, do not focus on the individuals, focus on the larger system. Yeah, we're going to move on to a guided demonstration. So we're going to do some cool stuff. And here are some recommended readings for those interested on where we got some of the information.
Yeah, you can attach it directly to the schedule. We'll continue over there on emailing this to everybody. And we're going to provide a GitHub link and we'll upload it there as well.
Okay.
And take us away? You want to take us away on the guided demo? All right, so I think first I'm going to point you to, if you're going to follow along, this is the URL. Give you all like 30 seconds if you're going to. So I think we're going to take about the next like 8 to 10 minutes to go through the demo, and then we're going to leave some time for questions at the end.
Okay, so yeah, we started this analysis with kind of a graph that kind of started to talk off. And as I mentioned at the start, this is what you might see accompanying the graph, like maybe even and then by this year, like grades. So this is like a high level look at the data. We come to give you like an example of what it looks like. And then we incorporated, so when we actually brought in the directory information.
I can point out some of these here. So this is just a list of all the fields that are available as far as the metadata on the middle schools. Not all of them are super clear based on the column names, but you can see a number of things like community service programs, summer sessions, accelerated classes, which just give you an idea as to like the range of options that are available for students in class. Like the classes, weekend programs. There's also information about like the count of students in the school, the count of teachers of different professions in the school, which you can use to create ratios and understanding of how many students might be available in classes for each topic. Honestly, we didn't even take a look at the full scope of it because there was just so much that was available. So if you have a broader range of questions beyond just like which students have which score, there's plenty that you can take a look at here. And I think that y'all will probably find like 10 times more than we would. Yes. This is another NYC open data set called the municipal directory. So we actually, like, this is using the same school code that was available in the original data set. We joined to this, and I got an additional 200 columns on the data set.
And when we then took a look at that relationship between student teacher-to-student ratio and math scores, we saw an interesting correlation in relation to the ratio teacher-to-student and then math scores. We split this up by demographics, but we were interested then to kind of dive into this a little deeper. This idea of actual support, student support by the teacher, and what that ratio looked like, how predictable that was in relation to math. Now, for the last part of this, I'm going to go into some detail, but I won't bore you with all the crazy excess stuff like this in bits of code here. But I was really interested in looking at how predict, like when we look at being able to predict kind of math scores. So essentially what I ended up doing was creating kind of mixed effects models where I allow some random noise to be incorporated and whether my data points are nested within demographics or if they're nested within. In one approach, I literally built two separate models, one that had demographics that like kind of random effect and one that had neighborhood as my random effect. And when I look at the amount of variance that my random effect counted for, so that's the main thing. How much variance in the data is my random effect accounting for? This is what I get roughly about 87% of variance when I look at neighborhood, compared to when I do a demographic alone model at about 41%. So neighborhood is kicking demographics ass in terms of variance that can be explained as a random effect. But then I decided, let me build a really complex model that allows my data points to be nested in both demographics and in neighborhood.
Like zooming in slightly.
Yeah. There we go.
I'm pretty with that stat background. Something very that's like unheard of.
Yes. Like we don't see that in social science. Yeah, like I mentioned, like so right here, when we look at a model that allows that nest our data points in relation to student to teacher ratio that are of the variance composed to a demographic model. But what I ended up doing then was let me actually do a more kind of close or more rigorous comparison. I built a much more complex model. And okay, I want to have my data nested in both demographics and neighborhood. And what we end up seeing at the end of the day, we still have neighborhood outperforming with the very least explaining more of the variance in relation to demographics. So comparing two models on their own, which is a bit more methodologically sound given how I had to put these models together, we see that neighborhood does a much better job explaining some of the variance ultimately in mathematics compared to demographics. When we actually throw in a more complex model, we want to compare the two. Ultimately, neighborhood is still doing the better. So I would argue, and I'm biased because it's my analysis, but I would argue that what I ended up doing was I wasn't focused on the individual. Like I know more context of what happens when we talk about mathematics education, when we talk about where resources allocated, when we talk about what the students are capable of, when we actually give them a chance, resources, opportunity. This is just the start. For those of you who pull the GitHub repo, you will see my super messy. I tried to clean it up code of how I put all these models together and assess them back and forth. But this is just a start. I talked about earlier. Information. There are a ton of other variables or things you could do to slice this data, take a look at it, ask what we would argue more interesting questions. And with that, we're going to go ahead and end the talk and open the floor for questions. Eligibility.
You mean like number 113?
So we didn't look at every indicator in here. I actually, like, if you want to replicate this code and add to it and take a look at it, please do. I think we did our best to set things up so that if you just want to mutate a few lines of our code and add a couple variables here and there, we're hoping that should be relatively straightforward if you have some experience with R in the tidyverse. But yeah, we really, like, truthfully, like, we put this together and realized that like the first 5 indicators that we took a look at in this data set were just so much better than just breaking things out by race. Yeah. So like we have not even begun to tap into the value of this additional data set.
University finally announced that like, having green zones like parks near you actually increases like your quality of life. And also just your general happiness, and that correlates to everything else. Kudos.
So obviously the demographic data is ubiquitous, right? And so it's everywhere. But I guess my question is, if you were to redesign how surveys are done and get the chance to start from the beginning, like how would you change the demographic questions? Would you keep them and just expand each category? Would you choose neighborhood, for instance, instead of other ones? Would there be a core set that you could use to replace what is currently used everywhere?
So I'm going to start with, I think the categories. I don't know if I'm not the expert in terms of dividing up the categories, like reassigning the categories themselves. I think there's an excellent amount of peer-reviewed research proposing categories that are better representations of people's experience, like what's your birth country, as opposed to just what's your race, as perceived by what other people see certain characteristics that you have. The one thing I would say is that like better categories are broken down much further than they are right now, as for the purpose of rolling people up and doing quick measures. And that just inherently conflicts with the ability to do effective statistical modeling when you capture a limited amount of data. So I would say, as far as categories that are more respectful of people's identities and experiences, as is way better research than we have, and I strongly recommend you look up peer-reviewed research on the topic. I do think they're worth capturing as one indicator among many, while also understanding that they're not the be-all, end-all. And if you're doing some kind of modeling, you need to include factors that you can actually impact and actually change. Because like if all your model is looking at is broken out by race, you can't change that about people. You can't effectively target people of different demographic groups in many cases.
And to add on to that, I am not an expert in how we would go about designing the better categories. I just know that I am not as invested in them. We know, for example, that issues such as like race and sexism based, but as the title for one of the articles we gave at Extended Reading will argue, the data just like that ain't going to save us. It's not going to change things immediately, or it's not even going to allow us to dive into some of the deeper questions and the deeper. I can just simply, I guess my kind of response to that of like, how do we make it better? My first question, more often than not, when we ask these questions is, why do you need the data in particular? Like, why do you need that data in that particular way? I can speak to a personal example. I was once working at an organization that served students, and there was a conversation that was brewing where the people who consume all the data came to us as a data team, and they're like, we would like to support our trans students more. And my response was, cool, leave us alone, because we are not collecting data on them. We are not categorizing them. We should not collecting data on them. So more often than not, why do we need the data? And unless we can answer that question, we gotta do more before we design the categories.
I guess I'm a little curious with the idea. Of course, we should have like things that we can do something with. But in terms of race, like we can't change race. But I think, for example, like the first chart that we saw, there could be two interpretations, right? Like someone could use it to say, to talk about individual differences across race or for their racist beliefs. But I think that could also be used to say, clearly there are like racist policies that are leading to this. So I think like getting rid of race would allow, like, it's very problematic as it is, but I think it can allow us to then be like, clearly, like there are some policies that we need to focus on that could reduce that gap in a different way that is not just like things like that are not just school level factors.
So one thing I want to follow up, and that's a really good point. One thing I want to follow up is this, what you brought up, which is very true, this notion of that there can be varying interpretations. That two people, two analysts, two funders, two different stakeholders, they could look at a graph like this and come to different conclusions. One that's more focused on the individual, and one that's more focused on the larger kind of social population. And I didn't put this in the talk, but I'm so glad that you talk about it now. There is an actual term that kind of addresses that. So the idea, if you were to look at a graph like this, and then make interpretations that are based off of individuals, clearly the groups on the bottom are just not doing as well, or there's something inherent about them. Theoretical psychologists, historical and critical psychologists would go as far as to argue that what we have done when you take that interpretation that blames people or sees them as deficient, We call that epistemological violence. There are alternative explanations that the data has not reasoned away. And if you take the one that views people as lower, you have done violence to that. But that is a really good point. And
I would just add one thing here is that if you are an analyst that is responsible for putting together these types of charts, findings, data sets for interpretation, like one of the items we included on the plan of care is is there a high probability that there are these multiple interpretations? And in general, I think as in data science or data analysis, I would definitely recommend if this is one of the outputs that you provide, strongly contextualize it with the information that people need to not draw those reductionistic and racist conclusions. And I see we're at time.
But thank you again.